Guess we need another minute. Hey everyone. I think this is on. All right, cool. Yeah, sorry for starting late. I do this thing where I show up at everything, even if I'm the person who's supposed to be talking. Just to quickly introduce myself, I've been doing analytics for the past 5 or 6 years. First in local media at in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. All right, I will talk closer to the mic, even though I think it sounds like the entire room is being filled by my voice, which I guess is kind of the point. But so I used to work in local media in Cedar Rapids for a local TV station and a local newspaper where I did analytics. After that, spent some time at the data science team at The Guardian in London. After that, I did some research around the impact of journalism and how you can measure that at the Tau Center at Columbia. And the latest work that I've been doing has been with Fusion, which is an American TV station and website, as a freelancer. And so I've seen analytics at sort of many different companies, and you often see sort of the same problems occurring again and again and again. And so this talk is going to be sort of about what I've learned from all my time. If you think about how most people, most people when they think about analytics, mission control is sort of the image that they're not getting or are getting on the screen, where you can only sort of vaguely see it, but sort of this idea of you have these people at mission control in Houston, the people at NASA, looking at 3-4 monitors, all with different numbers on them, and then if they look up, they see even more numbers because they're beamed on the walls. And that's sort of how I think a lot of us think of analytics, as having all of the data all of the time. And certainly that method has been very successful for NASA. If you think back to sort of the Apollo 13 disaster, well, it could have been a much larger disaster. When they figured out that Apollo 13, that they weren't going to be able to land on the moon, by having all of that data beamed back from the spacecraft to Earth and then onto these screens, and having all of these engineers and other people available to sort of figure out, well, what's going on here exactly. By having all of that information, they were able to get those astronauts home safely. So, it definitely worked for them. I think it has also worked very well in sort of the tech industry, where, I guess I'm not the only one who is sometimes surprised by how much money some of these tech startups are able to generate, either real money or money that they get from investors. And you sort of think like, well, some of these business models that they have, these technology startups, they're so weird, but somehow they're able to sort of extract money from that. And well, what is sort of the defining feature of Silicon Valley? I think it's that you have lots of really smart people looking at lots of data. So again, it's sort of that mission control metaphor. What I've found in the news industry is that for us, that sort of metaphor usually, it just doesn't work that well. And so instead of what we expect, which is sort of this idea that by having all of this data, we can make more objective decisions and we can get insight into things that otherwise we just couldn't know. Instead, sort of what we get is sort of a lot of noise and distraction and metrics that don't really matter. So if you think about what analytics has done for the news industry, well, it has given us the listicle, 25 things you should do before whatever. It has given us sort of headline hacking, like you will never believe what this firefighter did to save this cat. That's sort of what analytics has done for us in the news industry. But to be honest, I'm I'm not really a huge BuzzFeed detractor or that kind of thing. I think they're doing some good work as well. I think the main problem in the news industry has been that we just haven't been able to leverage analytics much at all. It just hasn't really done much for us, you know. And so that's kind of a puzzle, right? So it's worked so well for so many people in so many different places. It worked for NASA. Why can it not work for us? And I think, you know, some people at least have known it for quite a long while. And I really like this quote by Peter Drucker, which is from a piece he wrote in 1967. And it's, now psychology tells us that the one sure way to shut off all perception is to flood the senses with stimuli. That's why it's so important to exploit the computer's ability to give us only the information we want. What figures do I want? When do I want them? In what form? And how do I need them? And we must refuse to look at anything else. That's what Peter Drucker wrote. And if you apply that sort of idea to the news industry, what you see is that, first of all, well, we have definitely been flooding our senses with stimuli. I think a lot of us, you know, if you think about what kind of analytics software do you use, I think most of us have, you know, maybe Google Analytics, maybe Adobe Analytics. You probably have a couple of different analytics packages for social media. If you use Bitly for your short links, then those will have analytics. But then, of course, there's Twitter's own analytics, third-party analytics for Twitter, Facebook Insights, which is actually a really cool piece of software that Facebook provides for free, so that's kind of nice. But it all adds up, right? And all of those different software packages, or all of those different applications, have tens, hundreds of different dashboards, hundreds of different metrics to look at. And so the question becomes, well, what do you look at? What's important and what isn't? It's also a question of not only are we being flooded by stimuli, but it's happening constantly. You know, it's a flood. And so the effect of that is that, all right, so why do we look at analytics? Presumably because we actually want to do something with all of that data, right? We want to use it in some way. It has to be actionable. But the thing is, how many of you here are in a newsroom that has that capability of reacting to real-time information? That's a really hard thing to do. I know some newsrooms have been able to pull it off, and so, you know, they see that certain topics are trending, and immediately they can sort of get a reporter to work on that issue and then publish something, you know, an hour later. So it's sort of still relevant, and so they react to that real-time information, which is really impressive. Most of us cannot do that. And so I've been at newsrooms where people would be addicted to Chartbeat, and, you know, you couldn't pry it from their cold, dead hands. But then if you ask them, like, well, how do you actually use this information? It's like, oh, you know, I just think it's interesting, and that's just not enough. It's also, to a certain extent, a question of maturity, right? It's very easy to start cherry-picking data that supports your preconceived notions. And, you know, I think everyone has probably been in one of those meetings where someone shows up with sort of this grand idea of how to improve the newsroom, and then they say, like, well, I have the data, and it turns out that they just picked that one little metric that happened to sort of align with their point. And so, you know, handling data requires some maturity and sort of not cherry-picking the data just to prove your points, but instead using the data to you know, help you make your decisions the other way around. Another quote I really like, and I think sort of pertains to that, is the first principle is that you must never fool yourself, and you're the easiest person to fool. And like, well, one great anecdote about that is a couple years ago, Facebook did a big engineering effort to increase well, to decrease page load times. So they wanted videos to load faster, to load more smoothly, to have sort of fewer sort of jaggy parts and all of that. And they did a very big engineering effort, and they thought it was successful. But then they deployed it to their website. And what ended up happening was that all of their critical metrics went down. And so it turned out that videos were taking longer to load. There were more skips in the videos. Sort of like their worst nightmare was coming true. But you know, being pretty good engineers, I imagine, they started looking further. And what turned out to be the case is that, you know, after some work in trying to figure this out, they found out that actually their efforts had succeeded to such an extent that people from certain countries and people with really, really bad internet connections that had, until that point, not been able to use YouTube at all because it was just too damn slow, that from that point on, they could use YouTube, and they started using YouTube. But of course, the result was that you have suddenly all of these users on very, very slow connections on your website. And so your numbers are gonna go down, even though in actuality, your performance went way up and you've been able to reach an entirely new audience. I think what I really like about that anecdote is that it's analytics that messed it up in the first place by giving numbers that were irrelevant. And then secondly, it was more analytics that fixed the problem by showing what sort of the root cause of all of this was. But it's still an interesting question to ask, like, you know, what is actually the difference between all of these success stories we hear and all of these horror stories we hear? You know, it's probably what everyone says, but I don't have all of the answers, but I do think I have some of the answers. And so I want to walk through a couple of things that I have found work at the organizations that I've worked for, or that I've heard from other people that they've been able to apply with great success. And the first thing that I want to start with is not about analytics at all. So, like, you know, we do analytics because we want to improve our website, we want to improve our writing, we want to, you know, maybe make more money off of what we do, be able to hire more journalists. And analytics and data is one way to do that. It allows you to, you know, find new opportunities. But before you get to that, actually, you first want to figure out the very, very basic stuff. And a lot of people don't do that. So, for example, when you look at most news websites, you know, most of them are kind of crappy, but that's not the point. The point is that there are very easy things you can do to get massive increases in sort of the amount of visitors to your site and their experience on the site that people just don't do. Sort of the three easy things that I think of is, one, we all know that newsletters are a great way to drive traffic. And, you know, it's just a great service to your readers as well. You know, they get updated with sort of the latest news. Well, if you look on just any random news website, how long are you going to have to search before you find that subscription button to subscribe to to that newsletter? Or how many newspapers or news organizations still don't even have a newsletter? That sort of thing. If you look at the placement of the social media buttons to get people sharing your stories on social media, how many news sites have that actually figured out? And so those kinds of sort of very easy things you can do are often not taken care of. So why even start looking at analytics when you have those very basic problems to take care of? The same thing applies to the publication process, where I've done some analysis for various different newspapers, and if you look at, for example, the percentage of their articles that are being promoted on social media, and I mean any kind of social media, right? So like you can look on Twitter, you can look on Facebook, you can look on Pinterest. I don't care. You can look on the personal accounts of the journalist. You can look on domain accounts of the news organization. If you look at all of that, and then if you look at homepage promotion, where, is this article at all on the homepage, or is it on one of the main section pages, so it's at most 2 clicks away, which is already quite far, but If you look at all of that, then you see at most newspapers, what I find is that a certain percentage, 10, 20, 30%, it depends on the newspaper, is not being promoted anywhere. So they have these published articles that are sort of like ghosts. They're nowhere to be found, and you actually have to already know where they are. They might be in a subsection of a subsection, and the author was probably too lazy to, or too humble, I would say, to promote their own article on social media, and so it's nowhere. And if you have that problem, then what do you want to start doing with analytics? No, fix that problem first. And so the way you do that is not by promising yourself to be a better person, and from now on I will start to promote all of my articles. No, it's just use a stupid checklist. Before you publish articles, have like a 4 or 5 item checklist you go through. Like, do I have a plan for how I want to promote this? Do I have tweets that I have scheduled, for example, in Buffer? You probably want to schedule a couple of different tweets, for people in different time zones, or people who visit their site in the morning and in the evenings. You want to figure out, do we want to promote this on the homepage or not? And you kind of want to figure all of that out before you publish something. The same thing applies to sort of content standards. A lot of what I see is newspapers want to have journalists who put links in their stories. It seems like a simple thing. For 2 reasons. 1, just because it makes your story more interesting. 2, because a lot of those links can be internal links to other articles from your newspaper, and so that can drive traffic as well. And no matter how much editors try to promote that kind of behavior, it just doesn't work. But if you have a pre-publication checklist that everyone has to step through, at Fusion we're experimenting with doing some of this. If you have a checklist that you have to step through before you can publish, then it's just going to be taken care of. And that's like a really easy thing. It's like a zero technology, which is kind of awesome. But all right, at a certain point, you do get to the point where you actually do want to measure some stuff, right? I've already talked a little bit about the problems. I think the 2 main ones are when we measure things, we too often accept the defaults that we get. So, you log into Google Analytics and you figure out that, it says page views here, users here, sessions here. Oh, so those are going to be my top 3 metrics. So really, just because Google tells you that, puts that on their default dashboard, that's where you're going to pay so much attention to those metrics? That seems kind of backward. The other thing is that I think as an industry, we're very sensitive to hypes, and I've lived through quite a few of them. I think we started off with page views. After page views, a lot of people were talking about reach and sort of about brand authority. That was kind of hip for a while. After that, engagement became a really big one. And then, I think a couple months ago, one of the people from Medium said in a fairly interesting blog post that actually reading time is the metric that you should look at. Suddenly I get calls from some of the newsrooms I work with, like, we've figured it out, reading time, that's going to be our metric. It's like, really, one dude somewhere writes a blog post and suddenly you're going to change your entire analytics strategy? And so because of that, I'm not actually going to present the 5 metrics that you should track. I don't think I can do that, but I think there are certain properties of good metrics. Good metrics are almost exclusively ratios. I think I really like to point this out in the context of page views. So a lot of people have started hating on page views. Personally, I think page views is a perfectly good metric. It's just that in and of itself, it's not very informative. But if you start comparing it to something else, then it suddenly becomes really interesting. So for example, the simple operation of dividing your page views by the amount of articles that you publish, that's really interesting. You know, if you publish 100 articles on a given day and you get 1 million page views, and then the next day you publish 200 articles and you get 2 million page views, are you doing better? Well, no, you're doing exactly as you were. Like, you haven't improved at all. You're not getting any more page views per article. Your journalists are not working more efficiently. Your social media team is apparently not succeeding in getting more people to visit your site. But if you look at the numbers, you know, doubled. And so page views in that case is not the problem. It's the problem that you don't have the right thing to compare them to. So the kind of metrics that I like are ratios, like, for example, page views per article, page views per author, perhaps. Also, for example, instead of page views per day, think, for example, about page views per hour. Another thing I see a lot is that many newsrooms publish when it's most convenient to them, not when people are actually reading stuff. And it's sort of a chicken and egg thing, right? So, for example, a lot of newspapers publish very few articles during the weekend or sort of the very early hours of the day. And when you ask them, like, well, why is it that you publish so few articles at those hours and at those days? They will tell you, well, because if you look at the page views, then actually, you know, nobody's online at that time. Well, but you didn't publish any articles at that point in time, so why would they be on your site? And so it's sort of like a chicken and egg thing, and it's kind of cool to be able to experiment with that, experiment with different publication schedules, and try to figure out, well, is this sort of accepted wisdom, is it actually true for my organization or is it not? Another thing I like to do with the metrics I use is I try to make them as narrow and as focused as possible. So for example, I think loyalty is an interesting example where, you know, for example, one good metric for loyalty could be how many pages does the average user look at in a given month. The thing is, that's kind of an annoying metric, because if suddenly one of your stories goes viral, then that number is going to go way down, whereas, you know, having a viral story is kind of cool, right? But, you know, it'll just lead to lots of users that are, you know, just visiting your site once and disappearing, and so your numbers will drop down. It's not really very useful. One thing I like to do is institute this concept of the frequent user, sort of similar to what in tech circles they call it the daily active user, that kind of thing, where, you know, you can define it however you like. For example, someone who has visited in the last 3 days and who have at least 10 sessions in the last 30 days. That's sort of, you know, a fairly conservative idea of a frequent user. And what you see here on this chart, well, it's sort of deliberately quite vague, but sort of the top line is an actual overview of the users on a site that I work with. The bottom line is the amount of frequent users on that website. And what you see is that due to viral traffic, due to for all sorts of reasons, the traffic will often jump up and down wildly, and that doesn't reflect your performance at all. It's just sort of like a fluke. But the frequent user numbers, those stay fairly stable, so they're, you know, more reflective of your actual performance as a news organization. I think the best example of that is of how this can really work for you is probably Facebook, where if you look at the very early days of Facebook, they were only available at, you could only register with an email address from a select few colleges. They started at Harvard. And, so at those colleges, because they were, fairly small, like a couple colleges with maybe 10, 20, 30,000 students, obviously the absolute numbers, usage numbers of Facebook were low, right? They could not be high because the product was limited. But what they figured out fairly early on, and I don't know whether it was still Zuckerberg at the time looking at the numbers of someone else, but anyway, what they figured out fairly early on is that, well, if you look at any individual user, they actually stay on the site for a very long time. We've all probably heard those metrics, like, if people go to a news website, on average they stay for maybe 2-3 minutes. If people go to Facebook, they stay for, quite a number of minutes, or if they only stay for a short time, they return 4, 5, 6 days, times a day. And so they knew very early on that they had something that could work when they expanded it to other audiences. Why? Because the per user stickiness or addictiveness of the application was so high. And so by focusing on the right number and narrowing it down to that number, they were able to sort of ignore the very poor absolute usage numbers. I also really like qualitative metrics. I think something that I've been wanting to experiment with, but it's sort of hard to get a newsroom to accept it, but maybe some of you can give it a try, is ask every journalist after they've written a story and maybe a day after it's been published, what did you think of this story? How much did you like it? From a scale from 1 to 5 or something like that. How much did the audience like it? What's your estimate for that? What were the responses you got on Twitter? And that can be just a 1 to 5 as well. And then the third thing is, what would you do better next time? A lot of newspapers or news organizations do have sort of like these meetings where they discuss like, oh, these were what we thought were yesterday's top stories. But they usually don't really ask journalists in depth, like, well, what did you do that was good, and what did you do that you want to do better? And measuring that and then talking through those numbers, I think can be just as important as any kind of number you can find in Google Analytics. Your numbers don't have to come from software. They can come from people. That gets really important when we start talking about targets and goals. At a lot of newspapers, there's sort of the pernicious tendency to institute goals. And lately, goals are not enough anymore. Now, in addition to goals, there's reach goals. And if you don't reach the reach goals, then you're actually performing poorly, which I think is kind of a weird concept. Actually, what you find is that a lot of the times, overperformance can be just as bad as underperformance. What that means is, if you have authors that are pushing out 50 articles per week, then that's great, right? Maybe before they were only writing 1 or 2 stories a week, now they're writing 50 stories a week. Your metric went up. But what is going to be the effect on the quality of what you write? And so when you optimize for one thing, you often end up sort of totally ignoring other stuff. And so having those quality measures and having sort of a holistic overview of all of the different things that are important for a news website is really important. And often what you will notice is that there's a sweet spot. Like, maybe we can make our average article a little bit shorter so we can write a little bit more, and people are still happy with that shorter length, but we can write more, and so that's sort of a good sweet spot to hit. That's something you can do. Having sort of those targets or goals, like, this month we're going to try and get 1 million people to visit our site from social media. Well, how are you even going to get started doing that, and what is going to be the effect on other metrics. I think you also want to measure for the right reasons. I'm not really going to go very in depth on that, but so for example, you measure because you want to improve stuff. And so for example, one of the things you might be tempted to do is publish more articles, shorter articles, more articles, probably going to be, less quality in those articles, but what is going to happen is your page views will probably go up, because you can try this yourself. If you look at the correlation that you find between article length and page views, it is almost non-existent, right? It's like you think that long form would pay off in terms of page views. It does a little bit, but really not much. And so a lot of people end up optimizing for shorter articles, but then the thing is, what is that actually going to get you? Now you have these extra page views, but what are you going to do with that? I mean, some of it is helpful through display ads, but those pay hardly any money anymore. So instead, it can often make sense to focus on those long-form articles, on those sort of investigative pieces. Why? Because that is what's going to drive your loyal audience, and your loyal audience are going to be the people who are most likely to pay. And so this concept of garbage traffic, of having users come to your site, which you really don't want, they're just eating up your bandwidth, we would rather they just stayed away, is a very real concept and something you should take into account. A big thing for me, and it's sort of been a thread throughout this talk, is that metrics are for doing stuff. A lot of people hate this term, growth hacking. Think it's sort of cheesy. It's something that comes from Silicon Valley. But actually, the couple of anecdotes that I've done is sort of like Facebook, YouTube. It's no coincidence that those are technology companies. When I talk to people at technology companies, they're very interested to talk to me about marketing. They're very interested to talk to me about growth and tactics for achieving that. When I talk to people in news organizations, the question I usually just get is, what is the best metric? So sort of the difference in the level of conversation is sort of very tangible. You don't want to be asking, what is the best metric? No, you want to be asking, how can I improve my website so people like it more, so people visit it more? And so that connection of analytics to actually doing stuff is usually, at most news organizations, is not strong enough. It needs to be much stronger. And so instead of having analysts, what you really need is growth hackers, people who think about how can I grow the website. And analytics is going to be a big part of that, but it sort of follows from this desire to do better and not the other way around. And a lot of what you can do on that front is not very daunting at all. It's sort of like stuff anyone can do. For example, there's some of you have probably seen the Vox Evergreens experiment. So what they did was they took some of their best content that was published a month ago, maybe a couple months ago, that they thought still made sense today. They took that content, they made some slight updates to it. In some cases, new knowledge had become available. So they made some slight updates to those articles. They published them again. They put them on the homepage again. Turned out they got quite a lot of page views for articles that had disappeared, that nobody was looking at anymore, but just by putting them on the homepage again, by sort of freshening them up a little bit, people were interested again because maybe they hadn't seen them last time, or maybe they'd forgotten that they'd read it last time. And so I thought that was a really cool experiment that they did. Slate has done experiments around long form where they have journalists assigned one day of what they call I think they call it traffic whoring, so essentially just writing sort of lowest common denominator articles. But then in exchange for that, they get 1 or 2 days, I forgot, where they can work on whatever they want, and they have no obligations whatsoever to publish with any sort of frequency. They can really dig down. And so they were trying to figure out, well, what if we sort of bifurcate our traffic into those quick and easy pieces, and then the really, really deep pieces? Might that make a difference? And that's something that you all can try. Quartz did something similar, where they have this theory that there's sort of, I think it's around 600 to 800 words. People are not interested in reading news articles. They mainly prefer the quick update, which is 200, 400, 500 words, or the really long explainer type pieces. And so that's their philosophy that they're working from. And so you can do little content experiments like that. The only restriction, we are of course talking about slow analytics, is that you let these experiments run for a while. Sometimes I see people try out one article on a difficult topic. They do like a special on the environment. And all right, that special has lots of page views, lots of good responses on social media, and then the conclusion is, well, now every week we need to do a special about the environment. But that then usually doesn't work. You need data over longer periods of time. And actually the real problem there is I see a lot of people, well, not a lot of people, but colleagues of mine in analytics who complain about the fact that if you have a large news website, Google Analytics will start sampling your data, so you will get your results based on 10% of your data or that kind of thing. But that is actually not the problem. That's not the reason why you should run these kinds of experiments for longer amounts of time. The reason why you should run those experiments for longer is because there's all sorts of extraneous factors that can come in at any moment in time. When did you publish it? Who was the author of the piece? All of those kinds of things. And just by looking at more data over a longer piece of time, those confounders will tend to just sort of even out. Not always, but they often do. If metrics are for doing, that also means that you need the right metrics for the right people. I think I say this a lot, but a lot of people are frustrated with analytics because the metrics that they get are usually not useful for them. So for example, if I'm a designer, then I probably want to know whether that newsletter widget, where I can subscribe to the newsletter, whether that's working, whether it's converting users, whether more people are subscribing. As a journalist, I don't really care about that at all. I can't really do anything about that. As an editor, I might be interested to see, are there certain sections of the newspaper that people are really interested in? Are there certain topics that people really like? But as a journalist, knowing the page views for my article is sort of, I've already written it, so I can't really do anything about it anymore. So it makes people just feel really frustrated because they see metrics that they can't necessarily do anything about. Sort of the same thing with those huge dashboards that a lot of news organizations have put up on the wall. It says today you have had a total of 2 million page views, and this is 5% down from yesterday. All right, now I feel kind of bad because the numbers are down, but as one person, I cannot really do anything about that. That has to be an editorial decision. And so a lot of those dashboards I find are actually toxic rather than encouraging for people. And then sort of my favorite tool in the slow analytics toolkit is to dig a little deeper. And what that means for me is the export button is your new best friend. Actually, if you look at Google Analytics, if you look at Adobe Analytics, what used to be known as Omniture, if you look at Facebook Insights, which you have if you have a Facebook page for your newspaper, all of the numbers you can find there for any of the queries you might like, you can export that information. The really cool part about that is that you can then start to cross-reference all of that information. So you can start to cross-reference information from Facebook Insights with Google Analytics with your CMS. The Guardian, no, not The Guardian, The Atlantic did some really cool stuff around this where they categorized all of their page view traffic by the category of the topic that they covered, the tags that they cover. And so they did an entire content analysis of that where they found out that, you know, some topics are really good at driving traffic, others not so much. And you can only get those insights really if you get exports for, you know, maybe a full year, and then you get maybe a full year's worth of Facebook Insights data. And by putting that all together and by analyzing that massive amount of data, you can get at really at the underlying patterns rather than sort of the noise. And what I find when I do these kinds of analyses is that, one, they're usually sort of great for figuring out what new experiments you could start running. So for example, you find out that certain sections are doing really poorly. Well, then maybe you need to sort of change up the writing style a little bit and, you know, experiment with that and try to see how that works for those sections. Or maybe you have some really good sections that are performing really well. Well, publish some more pieces in that section. Does that still work? So doing those sort of big analyses can give you inspiration for new experiments to run. It also often gives you inspiration for what you should put on your checklists. So for example, this is the kind of analysis where you find out that 50% of your journalists, which is sort of a fair number at a lot of newspapers, that they don't put half of their articles on their own Twitter feed. It's like, you wrote it, why don't you put it on your Twitter feed? And so if you find out these things, then you can start putting them on a checklist, like, hey, have you thought about putting this article on your Twitter feed? Do you know where it's going to get promoted? And so that's sort of the origin, really, of where all of those checklists or checklist items come from. Summing up, if I find my notes, I think there is value in sort of real-time analytics and all that sort of stuff. I don't dispute it, but often it's really slow and steady that wins the race, and people are often sort of taken away by all of the cool functionality that all of these analytics packages have. The charts look really cool. You know, sometimes they update every second. It looks like you're on top of your game. It looks like you're one of those people in that mission control center, right? Like, you're the person who's getting those astronauts home safely. Whereas if you check some boxes on a checklist, or if you fix that newsletter subscription form, you know, nobody's gonna sort of pat you on the back and say like, well, you did really well there. But those are the things that actually make the difference. Those are the things that news organizations still have to figure out. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit, really. When it comes to metrics, we need more metrics that are sort of robust to change, where it's not like, oh, the season changes and now our page views are out of whack. No, you need metrics that really reflect how many loyal users you have, how well you're doing on social media, but separate from those loyal users. And you want to remove as much noise as possible from your metrics by narrowing them down. And then I think it's also about sort of trying to leverage low-tech tools. If you do those content analyses, you know, what you need is an export button and just, you know, stick it all in Excel and run some graphs, and that'll work. Same thing with a checklist or a quality scorecard where you ask every journalist to rate their articles, like, you know, how well did I think this article went for me, for the readers, what would I do differently next time? Those are all really low-tech tools, but they can really improve the quality of your newspaper, and then also sort of, you know, how many people visit. In the 70s, some of you may be familiar with this, Robert Solow brought forth his paradox. His paradox was that, you know, we have computers now, we have spreadsheets now, still very new in the 70s, but if you look at the economic productivity, it has not actually gone up by much, not as much as expected. You would think like computers will fix everything. Turned out in the 70s they weren't really fixing everything. I think it's sort of the same thing in the news industry, where we have these analytics and they have the potential to allow us to do so much better, but it's not actually working. And I think the way for us to sort of beat Solow's paradox is to start listening to Peter Drucker a little bit more and think really hard about, you know, what figures do I need? Why do I need them? In what form do I need them? When do I need them? And to start from there. And that is my talk. Thanks. I don't know if we still have time for questions, or yeah, one question apparently. Yes, anyone? Go ahead.
Am I going to ask the one and only question? I was wondering, because you talked a lot about how analytics enable you to optimize what you're doing. And oh, thank you. Thanks. So you talked a lot about optimizing what you're doing with analytics, and I'm just wondering if looking at what you're already doing can keep you from seeing really different things to do. Like, right. Does it keep you from making a leap to something that is totally different because it might not measure in anything that you're measuring?
Could you sort of give an example of how that could work?
I'm sort of thinking about this as an innovator's dilemma almost. Like, you're optimizing your website and then you have a really awesome website, but maybe your users are not on your website anymore. Right.
Yeah, I think sort of you know, in tech circles, where they talk a lot about pivots, you have this problem, right? Where, for example, if you think about Flickr, the photo sharing site, when they got started, they weren't actually a photo sharing site. They were a multiplayer online game that had social features. You know, this was the start of Web 2.0. And it turned out that the game they had, no one cared about it, but the social features, and in particular the photo sharing, people thought it was awesome. And so, you know, one day Flickr decided, well, let's just make a photo sharing site then. And at a certain point, you do have to ask yourself, like, well, we are news organizations, right? We could probably do much better by selling pornography instead, but then we wouldn't be a news organization anymore. And so there is certainly a limit to the extent in which you're, you know, supposed to follow the numbers. I don't know if that totally answers your question, but is that the end, or do we get more questions? Well, let's keep it to this. I'll stick around for a bit so you can ask me questions in the hallway. Thanks, everybody.